China Report.
I'm honored to present petition E2767, where the citizens of Canada call upon the Minister of Justice to amend Section 8.2 of the Privacy Act to include an additional circumstantial provision that would allow personal information under the control of a federal institution to be disclosed to a third party for the purpose of protecting an individual from interpersonal and domestic violence, otherwise known as Clare's Law. This would be a petition that would just give another resource to combat domestic violence.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétitions. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask that all questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
Agreed. Agreed. Orders of the day.
Business of supply, consideration of an opposition motion on the foreign policy toward China in the name of Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong, seconded by Monsieur Paulus, moves that given that the People's Republic of China, under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, is threatening Canada's national interest and its values, including Canadians of Chinese origin within Canada's borders. 2, it is essential that Canada have a strong and principled foreign policy backed by actions in concert with its allies. The House call upon the government to A, make a decision on Huawei's involvement in Canada's 5G network within 30 days of the adoption of this motion, and B, develop a robust plan, as Australia has done, to combat China's growing foreign operations here in Canada and its increasing intimidation of Canadians living in Canada, and table it within 30 days of the adoption of this motion. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be sharing my time today with the member for Charlebourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the government has made some accomplishments in terms of foreign affairs. It has concluded a new free trade agreement with the United States in very difficult circumstances. The new free trade deal with the EU was also concluded, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership was also negotiated by the previous government, was also concluded.
Accomplishments, Mr. Speaker. The government's overall foreign policy has been a disappointment. The government came to office telling the world that Canada is back, but the facts say otherwise. Last June, Canada lost the vote for the UN Security Council seat with 108 votes, 6 fewer votes than Canada got a decade ago. That is 6 fewer countries today that see Canada as a global leader than a decade ago. This is a quantitative indictment of the government's foreign policy. On foreign aid, the government has been a disappointment. It came to office saying that it was going to make Canada a leader in helping the poorest around the world. The opposite has happened. Under this government, official development assistance has declined by 10% to 0.27% of gross national income, compared to the previous Conservative government's decade in office, when ODA averaged 0.3% of GNI. On climate change, this government has been a disappointment. It came to office promising to do better, but the facts say otherwise. Under this government, Canada's emissions have been increasing. It came to office in its first full year in office in 2016. Canada's emissions were 708 megatons. In 2018, the last year for which we have data, Canada's emissions rose to 729 megatons. But it is on China that this government has been the biggest disappointment. China is not upholding its responsibility to the rules-based international system. It is ignoring its condition of entry into the WTO. It is manipulating its currency, using state-owned enterprises to interfere in other countries' economies, infringes on intellectual property, and violates international law in its treatment of Canadians Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, Gary Schellenberg, and Hussein Jalil. It violates international law in its treatment of the people of Hong Kong and in its treatment of religious and ethnic minorities such as the Tibetans and the Uyghurs in China. In short, China is threatening our interests and our values. In that context, it is really important that the Government of Canada speak with a clear, consistent, coherent voice. Unfortunately, that is not happening. Last January of last year, the Prime Minister said he wasn't going to intervene in the judicial proceeding concerning Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver. The same week, the Canadian ambassador to China, Ambassador McCallum, said the government should intervene and trade Meng Wanzhou for Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And this inconsistence and incoherence continues to this year. In July, the Foreign Minister told this House that he's looking at sanctions on Chinese officials for their actions with respect to Hong Kong. The very next day, the government told Reuters that that was off the table. In September, the Foreign Minister told the Globe and Mail that the pursuit of free trade with China was being abandoned. The same day, Ambassador Barton, Canada's ambassador to China, was in Edmonton telling an audience, including the Chinese ambassador to Canada, that Canada should do more in China and expand trade with China. These are just a few of the many, many examples. The government itself acknowledges implicitly that its China policy isn't working. It's acknowledged it by its recent change in rhetoric on China this fall, and it's acknowledged it by its announcement that it plans to come forward with a new framework on China this fall by December 24th. And that's why I've introduced the motion today. Any new framework on China must include two elements. First, it must include a decision on Huawei. In May of last year, the government said it would make a decision on Huawei's involvement in Canada's 5G network before the 2019 election. That July, it changed its mind and said it would make a decision after the 2019 election. It's now been more than a year since the last election and still no decision. And it's been years since the government first started deliberating on this decision. The consequence of these years of delay and indecision on part of the government is threatening Canada's national security. Because of the government's delays on this file, a major Canadian telecommunications company, TELUS, went ahead and purchased Huawei's equipment for its network and installed it in the National Capital Region, where most of Canada's federal government offices are, including the RCMP, CSIS, the Department of National Defence, and other military installations, despite having reached an agreement with the federal government not to use Huawei's equipment in the region. And now reports indicate that the federal government is scrambling to get TELUS to remove its equipment, which has now been installed on some 80 towers and sites in the National Capital Region. Under Article 7 of China's National Intelligence Law, Huawei must support, assist, and cooperate with China's intelligence activities. The government's lack of action on Huawei demonstrates something else: the yawning gap between its rhetoric and reality. The government says that it believes in multilateralism, but when given the opportunity, fails to act. Huawei is a good case in point. 4 of the 5 Eyes intelligence partners, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and the United Kingdom, have banned or put restrictions on Huawei's involvement in their networks. Canada is unilaterally alone in failing to take action. It is long past time for the government to make a decision on Huawei. No framework on China is complete without it. Any new framework on China must also include a robust plan to counter China's subversive operations here in Canada. China, through its agents and foreign operations here on our soil, is threatening our national interest and our values. It's intimidating Canadians, particularly Canadians of Chinese origin. It's spying and cyber attacking our citizens, our companies, and the federal government itself. And it's spreading disinformation. It's engaging in elite capture, the provision of monetary inducements and sinecure to retired bureaucrats and retired politicians. It's providing financial support for research institutes that support Beijing's positions, such as the Confucius Institutes. It's co-opting Chinese language media and local organizations on the ground to promote Beijing's interests. It's surveilling and organizing Chinese foreign students at Canadian universities to stifle on-campus debate and threaten others, as it's done at the University of Toronto and McMaster University, and it's interfering in the Chinese community by mobilizing political support against those who do not support Beijing. There are countless examples of China's influence operations here in Canada, documented by CSIS, by the RCMP, by Amnesty International, and by this House's own committee, the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. So any new framework on China must include a plan that does more to protect Canadians from China's foreign influence operations here in Canada, as our allies have already done, allies like Australia. Mr. Speaker, this government came to office talking about responsible conviction. That was jettisoned for Canada being an essential country. And now we get a new framework on China. Any new framework must include a decision on Huawei and a robust plan to protect Canadian citizens and Canadian interests from China's subversive foreign influence operations here on Canadian soil. A final point, Mr. Speaker, on the timing in the motion. The motion calls on the government to make these two decisions within 30 days. The government has announced for months that it is coming forward with a new framework on China by the end of this fall, which ends on December 24th. So the timing of the motion's provisions is very reasonable. And that's why I've introduced this motion, and I hope members will support it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the intervention today from my colleague across the way. And I know that just very quickly to address something that he said in the beginning of his comments about increased emissions in Canada. I think it's all relative. I'm sure as we look back on 2020, we'll see as a result of COVID-19 and economic underperformance, we're going to see that those emissions are lower than before. I'm wondering if he's interested in qualifying his statement to reflect the fact that things are relative. Perhaps he wants to compare that back to the economy. But specifically towards the motion that he's introduced today, I respect the fact that he's come up with the 30 days based on the timeline and his calculation back from the end of the fall. Does this mean that he's open to possibly extending that timeline slightly to make sure that all information and that the proper attention can be paid to such an important response?
A member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, we're open to looking at any amendments that any member of this House proposes. We'll have to see the substance, the details of the amendment before we make a decision. With respect to the member's earlier question, with respect to climate change, I'll paraphrase Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray. Declining national income is no way to either meet Canada's overseas development assistance goals, nor is it a way to meet our climate change goals.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Bloc Québécois, globally, agrees with the motion. We have the same concerns as those expressed here today with respect to the 30-day time period. I'd like to ask the honourable member, why not wait for the outcome under the special committee? You, the Conservatives, asked for it. Why not wait for the conclusions of that committee to be published? The honourable member for Wellington-Hollington Hills. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. The reason is simple. First of all, the government announced that it would be introducing a plan before Christmas to resolve our issues with China. And as the official opposition, we feel that it's very important for that plan to include two components. First of all, a decision on Huawei, the Chinese company, as well as a plan to deal with Chinese operations on Canadian soil. That is the reason why we have introduced this motion to the House today.
Some comments. The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Wellington, Halton Hills, for bringing this motion forward today, Mr. Speaker. And I want to ask my colleague if he believes that Canada needs to bring in legislation to combat foreign interference from China and other state parties here in Canada.
Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, in short, the answer is yes, we believe legislation is needed, a new legislative framework to deal with a number of issues. For example, we believe that former senior politicians and former senior bureaucrats should register their contracts if they're working for a foreign state or an entity controlled by a foreign state. We also believe that there needs to be better enforcement tools available to law enforcement to counter these subversive Chinese foreign influence operations on Canadian soil. So those are just two measures that we believe need new legislation in order to provide the tools necessary to counter these activities.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to attend, obviously, the speech by my colleague this morning. But one thing he failed to mention, Mr. Speaker, and that's what I'm inquiring, why is he not talking about Canada's leadership when it comes to doing and taking action? Why is he not mentioning to Canadians who are watching us that Canada was the very first country to suspend the extradition treaty between Canada and Hong Kong? Why is he not mentioning, Mr. Speaker, to Canadians that Canada suspended the export of sensitive equipment? Why is he not mentioning to Canadians that we took immigration measures? And why is he not mentioning that among the Five Eyes, Mr. Speaker, I chaired the meeting of the Five Eyes. I consulted with our British counterparts at every step of the way, and we are continuing to engage with our partners around the world to show leadership, to take action, to stand up for Canadian values and interests.
Honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that the minister has listened to the debate and is attending today's debate. With respect to his question, I've acknowledged some of the government's foreign policy accomplishments, particularly in the area of trade, but I disagree with him on the issue of Hong Kong. The fact of the matter is that other countries were much more vocal about the challenges in Hong Kong in 2019. Canada wasn't the first to indicate its concerns, and and on the issue of immigration from Hong Kong, Canada's plan pales in comparison to that of the United Kingdom, which is allowing admissibility for residency and a path to citizenship for up to 2.9 residents of Hong Kong through the recognition of the British National Overseas Passport. The Minister of Immigration's plan is a pale imitation of that plan, and will merely admit some thousands of Hong Kongers who want to seek asylum here in Canada.
December of 2019, where I spoke in favor of a Canada-China Special Relations Committee because the Minister of Foreign Affairs had said publicly that there was no framework on China. And unfortunately, due to the prorogation by the government, that particular committee lost a lot of time. And during that time, just previous to the prorogation, we had heard from many at the committee, many citizens who had said that they had been intimidated by the communist Chinese government operatives here in Canada. Yesterday, the Minister of Immigration said he had never canceled any permit to be in Canada. Does the member believe that the government is allowing this kind of intimidation and has been silent? How many more times do we need to hear that this is a problem in Canada before this government acts? I'd like this member to speak on this concern.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I'm happy because I'm a member of the Canada-China Committee and I participate in its deliberations, and we've heard evidence that there are a lot of problems with bullying and intimidation of Canadians of Chinese origin who live here. They're being intimidated directly within our territory, and we mustn't turn a blind eye to that. Things have to be done on university campuses or in industries, wherever those people are. When you come to Canada as an immigrant, when you're a Canadian of Chinese origin, it makes no difference. We need to protect our citizens.
Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, Monsieur le Président, I'm pleased to rise in this House today to address the motion brought forward by the member from Wellington, Alton Hills, and our dear colleague from Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. For both, I have enormous respect, and I've said it many times in this House. Mr. Speaker, this year marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Canada and China. This anniversary is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the foundations of our relations and how to adapt going forward. In light of the current challenges, we take a sober view in assessing the relationship 50 years on, considering the importance of mutual respect and reciprocity, adherence to rules and principles, including human rights, and achieving results that are in Canada's interests. While we share long-standing connections that took root well before the establishment of diplomatic relations, today we are facing a difficult reality. Less than 4 weeks before the second anniversary of their detention, Canadians are deeply concerned by the arbitrary detentions of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. The use of coercive diplomacy, an ongoing crackdown on freedoms in Hong Kong, human rights violations in Xinjiang and Tibet, not to mention the hostile activities against Canadians, are entirely at odds with Canadian values and interests. Our government continues to be unequivocal on these issues, making sure that our stance is clear to China at all times. But, Mr. Speaker, we're not alone. Not only Canada, but many like-minded democracies have raised their voices to challenge China on the question of arbitrary detentions and other human rights abuses in China, most recently in a joint statement at the UN General Assembly Third Committee, which was signed by Canada and 38 other states on Xinjiang and Hong Kong.
Mr. Speaker, it's important for China to recognize that its actions do damage to its reputation in the eyes of many other countries, not just Canada. And they're sending a bad message to the international community, given the hardening of China's position, as well as a broader geostrategic context. We are taking an approach to China that's based on 3 fundamental pillars: Canada's long-term interests, our fundamental principles and values, including human rights, and global rules and partnerships. We will do this while at the same time continuing to defend and protect Canada and Canadians from activities that undermine our democratic values, our sovereignty, our economic interests, and obviously national security in general.
The promotion and protection of human rights is an integral part of Canada's foreign policy, and we will continue to play a fundamental role in the government of Canada's engagement with China. We will continue to raise our voice to express our concerns about China's behavior and failure to abide by its international obligations. The best way to do this is to continue working with our allies and partners to hold the Chinese government accountable and to defend the rules-based international order. We will also continue to pursue cooperation when it aligns with our national interests. China is a key player in the global commons in the fight against COVID-19, climate change, or to ensure the stability of financial markets, and global economic development. We are aware that China is and will remain an important commercial partner for Canada. China is also a significant source of tourists and students to Canada and bring economic and enriching social benefits across our nation. Canada believes in a strategic approach to trading with China, and we will also continue to encourage trade diversification. While cooperation in these areas is beneficial, Canada is taking a clear-eye view in examining our relationship. And we're not alone, Mr. Speaker, in recognizing the need for a new approach. Like-minded democracies around the world are adjusting to the new dynamics that have emerged in recent years. And as I've said, we will and we are continuing to engage with eyes wide open. As part of our assessment, Mr. Speaker, we continue to be seized at all levels of government by the cases of Canadians detained and sentenced arbitrarily in China. It is unacceptable that any citizen anywhere be arbitrarily detained. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor must be brought home, full stop. This is something for which all Canadians stand united, and I'm sure every member of this House. The government has been very clear that the detention of these two Canadians is unacceptable, that their arbitrary detention is something that we will speak against at every opportunity, and that they must be immediately released. We are encouraged by the fact that Ambassador Barton was able to have consular access to Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor this fall after more than 8 months without contact. This is something I had personally raised in a meeting with my counterpart, State Councillor Wang Yi in Rome in August of this year, and on which we have worked tirelessly. We continue to request ongoing access to them and all Canadians which are detained in China. We also continue to provide all appropriate support for Mr. Robert Schellenberg and oppose the arbitrary decision to issue a death penalty sentence at his retrial. We continue to call on China to grant clemency to Canadians facing death sentences. As we work to resolve these serious conditions, the government will also continue to provide consular support to them and their families and press for consular access to all Canadians detained in China. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, I've been talking to the families regularly to update about what we're doing and to really take an approach that would be all hands on deck when it comes to obtaining the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and other Canadians. Monsieur le Président, je voudrais...
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to turn now to the situation here at home. Like many other open and free democracies, Canada is the target of hostile states looking to acquire information and influence to advance their own interests. This threat is nothing new, and it's not limited to just one country. Governments all around the world are increasingly involved in revealing and countering the efforts of hostile states to acquire information and interfere in democratic institutions in order to advance their own interests. State and non-state actors may be a threat to our security, have increasing recourse to economic tools. Our government knows that economic threats may not only affect conventional concerns like national security, but also long-term prosperity, economic competitiveness, and our economic, industrial, military, and technological advantage. This situation is exacerbated by globalization, the internet, and social media platforms. The availability of cyber tools that are cheaper and more accessible enables hostile actors to conduct cyber operations that are hard to attribute This has become even more obvious since the pandemic started. For example, our government has on many occasions recognized the increased risk of foreign interference and espionage affecting the outstanding efforts of our biopharmaceutical companies, of our university and scientific research centers, of various levels of government and organizations participating in international efforts to develop a vaccine.
This is why our domestic agencies have been working tirelessly with these entities to raise awareness of the threat, ensure that they have the tools and information they need to protect themselves and their proprietary information. Mr. Speaker, our government is equally aware of intimidation tactics being used against Canadians in Canada. And that is something which is of great concern to me, my colleagues, and this government. State actors target the fabric of Canada's multicultural society, seeking to influence communities, including through pressure and threats. States may attempt to threaten and intimidate individuals outside their country. These tactics can also be used as cover to silence dissidents, pressure political opponents, and instill a general fear of state power, no matter where a person is located. Any report of harassment and intimidation of individuals in Canada is troubling and will not be tolerated. And we invite Canadians to report any such action to law enforcement officials. CSIS uses the full mandate of the CSIS Act in order to investigate, advise, and respond to any threat to the security of Canada. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police will continue to investigate with a view to laying charges under the Criminal Code. An open and multicultural society is at the heart of our Canadian values.